You are standing in the stillness before dawn. The air dense, perfumed, and utterly silent. The marble beneath your feet glows faintly in the lamplight, as if it remembers every secret ever whispered through these corridors. Then, without warning, the silence splits. A scream, sharp, unguarded, and human, tears through the air, echoing down the endless galleries of Topkapi Palace. It sounds like the cry of a soul discovering that freedom was only ever an illusion. Before we step deeper into this story, take a moment to join the conversation. This channel's audience spans from Istanbul to Jakarta, from London to Sao Paulo, a community bound by curiosity about the hidden pages of history. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. And if you find stories like this worth unearthing, consider subscribing. Your voice helps bring these forgotten echoes back to life. The cry belonged to a girl barely 15, a daughter of the Sultan, born in the lap of unimaginable power, yet trapped in the same machinery that her father commanded. The guards at the corridor's edge froze, unsure whether to move or to forget. No one in the palace disobeyed silence, especially not when the sound came from the wing of the royal harem, the most forbidden of all worlds. The night was meant to be sacred. Gold-threaded banners fluttered in the courtyards, and the scent of jasmine hung heavy in the air. Outside, the city of Istanbul glimmered like molten bronze beneath a crescent moon. Inside, however, the world had narrowed to a single chamber, a room draped in crimson and ivory, where a young princess awaited her fate. To the empire beyond, this was a marriage of honor, the union of a royal daughter and a loyal statesman. But within those jeweled walls, something older and darker stirred. It was a ritual never recorded in official ledgers, whispered only among the women of the court. A ritual that made the wedding night a trial of obedience. As servants lit the final oil lamps, the princess sat motionless, her hands trembling in her lap. The silk of her gown rustled like water. Her hair, perfumed with amber and rosewater, cascaded down her shoulders in perfect symmetry. She had been taught for weeks to move without sound, to bow at the precise angle, to smile without showing teeth. Perfection, they told her, was not beauty. It was surrender. Outside the chamber, eunuchs stood guard, their eyes downcast. None dared look upon the daughter of the Sultan. Even they, stripped of power and desire, feared the weight of the moment. Beyond them, in a neighboring room, the elder women of the palace murmured prayers, or perhaps apologies, under their breath. The empire they served was built on discipline. Every gesture, every breath was part of a system that had outlasted centuries. The Sultan's word was law, his household a mirror of divine order. But within that divine order, his daughters had no voice. They were tokens in a game of alliances, their bodies signatures on treaties that could not be written in ink. Tonight, one such treaty was being sealed. The chosen groom was a man twice her age, a soldier molded by campaign and conquest. He had fought Persians and Venetians, lost friends to plague, and now found himself trembling not on a battlefield, but before a silk-draped door. For his loyalty he had been granted the highest honor a man could receive, the hand of a princess. But that hand was cold, its pulse rapid with terror. Inside, the chamber had been prepared according to ancient custom. At its center stood the nuptial bed, its canopy embroidered with verses from the Quran, invocations of peace and mercy that seemed to mock the dread in the air. Servants had scattered rose petals, though their scent was faint against the bitterness of burning myrrh. Every surface glimmered with opulence, yet no warmth reached the room. The ritual began not with celebration, but with silence. The princess's attendants removed her jewels, each piece placed into a lacquered chest as if burying fragments of her identity. A veil was drawn over her face, translucent, almost ghostly. Her lips moved in prayer, but no sound emerged. One of the elder women approached, placing a hand upon her shoulder. "The daughter of the Sultan does not weep," she whispered. "She endures." Those words were the true creed of the harem. endurance disguised as virtue. As the hour deepened, the doors closed. What happened within was spoken of only in veiled metaphors: the joining, the fulfillment, the seal. Yet every witness knew that for many royal daughters this night marked not the beginning of a life, but the quiet extinguishing of one. The Empire's chronicles would later record only the celebration, the fireworks over the Bosphorus, the lavish feasts, the coins distributed to the poor. Of the scream that tore through the palace before dawn, nothing was written. When the morning call to prayer rose over the city, the palace stirred once more. The servants resumed their routines, the viziers gathered in council, and the Sultan received reports of his daughter's marriage with calm satisfaction. Only those who had heard the cry, the guards, the attendants, the nursemaids, carried the memory like a forbidden relic. One of them, years later, described it in a single, trembling sentence. It was not the cry of pain, but of something being unmade. Behind the curtains of Topkapi, such cries were not rare, only silenced. Each represented the unseen cost of empire, the sacrifices demanded not on battlefields, but within its own gilded walls. And though centuries would pass, and the empire itself would crumble into dust, the memory of that night, the night when a princess's voice defied the law of silence, would linger like the echo of a wound that never healed. The empire would call it tradition. History would call it destiny. But for those who lived it, it was something else entirely, the beginning of a ritual that would haunt the daughters of the Ottoman line for generations to come. And beneath the marble floors of Topkapi, the echoes of that first cry still seemed to travel, faint, cold, and unending. Morning in the harem arrived not with sunlight, but with sound, the whisper of slippers on marble, the rustle of veils, the rhythmic sweep of palm brooms. The air was heavy with rosewater and control. Every movement, every breath, followed an invisible rhythm composed long before any of the women were born. In this world, obedience was not a virtue. It was architecture. Deep within the imperial palace, the courtyards were alive with quiet purpose. Servants moved like shadows through the dawn mist, while tutors and matrons took their places along the corridors. The princesses, still children, were already dressed in silks too fine for comfort, their backs straight, eyes lowered. From above, the latticework of gold and cedar let in slivers of light that fell like bars across the floor. Even illumination in the harem seemed to remind them of captivity. It was here that the ritual began. The sacred training, known in fragments of court records as Terbiye-i-Mubarak, the blessed discipline. But those who endured it called it by another name whispered only after dark. The breaking. Each girl began her day with silence. Words were rationed, questions forbidden. Meals were eaten without sound, and water was poured only after permission. At the sound of a bronze bell, they assembled in the Hall of Instruction, a domed chamber where murals of celestial order, suns, moons, and constellations, seemed to watch their every motion. The design was deliberate. As the heavens obeyed divine law, so too would the daughters of the Sultan obey the law of men. The instructor that morning was Gulbahar Hatun, a woman of iron composure and diamond gaze. She had served 3 reigns and buried her compassion in each. Her task was simple: to unmake will. A princess must be like the Bosphorus, she would say, her voice as smooth as the marble beneath her feet, strong in silence, deep in obedience. The exercises began with posture. Each girl stood for hours, balancing a small porcelain bowl on her head while reciting verses on loyalty and virtue. If the bowl fell, they began again. Some collapsed, trembling, others fainted and were revived with rosewater before continuing. To falter was not failure. It was proof that pride remained, and pride was a sin that had to be extracted like poison. As days turned to weeks, the lessons grew more intimate, more invasive. They learned how to smile without joy, how to bow without fear, how to look at a man's feet rather than his face. Their laughter, the natural sound of youth, was replaced by rehearsed politeness, a shallow echo of pleasure meant to soothe, never to express. Among the trainees was a young woman named Aishi Sultan, barely 13, whose sharp wit once amused the palace tutors. Within months, that light dimmed. Witnesses recorded that by the end of her training, she spoke in monotone, as if even emotion required permission. Her journals, hidden behind a loose stone in her chamber wall, revealed a mind collapsing under the weight of obedience. "They say this is to make me worthy," she wrote, "but I feel less human each day. I am learning how to disappear." The disappearance was the point. Through repetition and ritual, the training rewired identity. Princesses who once debated scholars were taught instead the virtues of patience and silence. They were forbidden to use personal pronouns in conversation. "I" was replaced with "your servant." Every instance of selfhood became a transgression. Even prayer was transformed. 5 times a day they knelt before embroidered curtains and recited invocations written not from scripture, but from palace decree, oaths that sanctified submission. "Obedience is peace," one verse began. "To serve is to ascend." These were not prayers of faith, they were catechisms of control. Punishment was woven seamlessly into the process. A wrong glance could mean a day of isolation in the reflection room, a chamber lined entirely with mirrors. There, the offender sat alone, forced to confront her own image until even her reflection seemed to accuse her. Some emerged hollow-eyed, others murmuring apologies to their mirrored selves. It was not all cruelty, at least on the surface. The matrons praised progress, offered sweets for perfect recitations, and bathed the girls in scented oils after every milestone. The empire knew the strength of velvet chains, how comfort could dull the edge of rebellion more effectively than fear. Yet, beneath the illusion of refinement, the transformation was absolute. By the end of the training, the princesses no longer walked like children. They glided, their voices softened to whispers, their eyes lowered instinctively, not out of choice, but habit. They had become precisely what the empire required, living symbols of serenity, silent witnesses to their own erasure. In rare moments of solitude, some tried to remember who they had been before the training began. A favorite song, a scent, a word once spoken too freely. But memory itself became fragile, slipping away like incense smoke. One survivor would later write, "They took our speech first, then our laughter, then our dreams. In the end, only silence remained, and they called it grace." Outside, the world continued to turn. Wars fought, treaties signed, dynasties rising and falling. But within the harem, time held still, repeating itself through every new generation of royal daughters. Each endured the same rituals, the same education, the same quiet unmaking of self. And when the training ended, when the tutors declared them ready to be given in marriage, there was no joy, only a stillness too deep for words, the stillness of minds shaped not to think, but to obey. On the final day of instruction, Gulbahar Hatun dismissed her pupils with the same benediction she had spoken for decades. "You are the reflection of the empire. Let no light within you disturb its order." The girls bowed, silent and perfect. But that night, one servant claimed she heard faint sobs echoing through the marble hall. Not loud enough to break the rules, only enough to remind the palace that even obedience has a pulse. The candlelight trembles against the latticework of her chamber. A year has passed since the drums of her wedding thundered through the courtyards, yet their echoes remain trapped beneath her skin. Before her stands a mirror framed in mother of pearl, a gift from her husband, untouched since the night it arrived. The woman who gazes back is no longer the daughter of a sultan, nor the bride of a pasha. She is something quieter, sculpted from obedience, hollowed by ritual. Her reflection blinks, but she no longer feels it belongs to her. Beyond her window, the Bosphorus glimmers in winter's breath. Ships move like slow shadows on the water, their lanterns flickering through the mist. The empire thrives. Soldiers march, ambassadors kneel, poets praise the Sultan's glory. And yet, within these gilded walls, the smallest victories are the act of breathing unseen. Each woman here is a monument to silence. They smile when summoned, pray when watched, and vanish when no longer useful. The princess's name has long been erased from records, reduced to the consort of. But within forbidden letters smuggled through the laundry of the palace, fragments of her voice survive. "They taught me to bow before I could read," she wrote, "and to smile when I wanted to scream. These were not words meant for rebellion. Only confession, whispered into the margins of a life she could not claim." She was not alone. In Isfahan, beneath the mirrored domes of the Safavid court, daughters of kings were taught the same choreography. Their beauty measured, their silence prized. In Versailles, the Dauphine's laughter was rehearsed like a hymn. In Beijing's Forbidden City, the emperor's wives slept in chambers so quiet that even the rustle of silk was a trespass. Across continents and centuries, empires shared one unspoken scripture, that obedience was the finest ornament of royal blood. But what becomes of an empire built upon the stillness of its women? In Topkapi's harem, every gesture was performance, a glance, a breath, a tremor of the hand. To displease the Valida Sultan was to vanish overnight. The princess had learned this early, when a maid who dared to speak without bowing was never seen again. The silence that followed was a warning carved into memory. The scent of rosewater lingered, and no one dared mention her name. Some nights, the princess would hear the faint music of the courtyard, the plucking of a tambour, the murmur of eunuchs, the laughter of those who still believed in favor. She would close her eyes and imagine walking beyond the palace gates, down to the harbor, where fishermen cursed the tides and lived without titles. She wondered if they too were trapped in invisible prisons, or if the sea forgave them more easily than God forgave his daughters. Her husband, the governor of distant provinces, returned only twice in that first year. He spoke little. His words were heavy with formality, his hands colder than the marble beneath her feet. "You are well?" he asked, as if addressing a servant. She nodded. To answer otherwise would have been treason against the order that bound them both. When he left, the palace resumed its rhythm, the sound of slippers against stone, the hum of women pretending contentment, the flutter of veils that hid exhaustion. And yet, rebellion takes strange shapes. It can live in a letter never sent, in a melody hummed under one's breath, in the refusal to forget one's own name. The princess began to write, not in Ottoman script, which could be intercepted, but in a secret code of her own invention. Between her prayers and lessons, she inscribed memories onto scraps of linen, a description of a storm, the laughter of her mother, the color of the sky before dawn. She buried them beneath the tiles of her chamber floor. Centuries later, when the palace became a museum, workers repairing the flooring found fragments of linen with faded ink. No one could decipher the script, but the handwriting trembled with urgency. Historians speculated they were devotional verses or household records. But perhaps they were something more dangerous, the memory of a woman who dared to write herself back into existence. Outside, the city continued to change its rulers, its laws, its gods. The empire of men rose and fell, its monuments crumbled, its banners replaced. Yet the empire of silence endured, the invisible kingdom governed by every woman who had learned to smile through obedience. In the final years of her life, the princess was buried not in the imperial tombs, but in a small, unmarked garden near the sea. When the tide rose high enough, the waves touched the edge of her grave, carrying with them whispers of salt and forgiveness. Some said that on quiet nights, when the wind sweeps through the Bosphorus, you can still hear the faint rustle of her veil, not in mourning, but in defiance. And in that sound, fragile, persistent, unrecorded, lives the question that history never answered. Who truly ruled the empire and who paid its price?